What's your sense of the appetite on the Republican side? Are they all looking at the current economic uncertainty and thinking maybe it's a time to stand up?
I don't think Republicans are going to save us. I mean, I just think they have made their decision that they are going to be employees of Donald Trump. The best we can expect is, a couple murmurs of criticism now and again. It was stunning how they didn't defy him at all on his nominees, some of which were just wildly, criminally unfit for those jobs. I think the only way that this country is saved from the destruction of our democracy that is underfoot is for the people of this country to rise up, and whether it's in special elections in the midterms or ultimately in 2028, kicking all these guys out of office. I wish that weren't the case. I mean, I literally just came off of 3 years in which I was working every single day across the aisle, passing big bipartisan pieces of legislation. I don't know that that era is dead, but for the time being, I just haven't seen any signs that Republicans are going to stand up to him. And so I think it would probably be a mistake for us to devise strategies that are dependent on Republicans doing the right thing, something they have been unwilling to do for a long period of time.
Describe the difference between how Senate Republicans behaved in Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0.
Well, I think that's a good question. There's not a lot of differences. Remember, in Trump 1.0, he actually wasn't doing a lot. It was a lot of bluster, but there wasn't actually a lot of sort of immediate daily danger to our democracy in the way that exists today.
I would argue congressional leaders, but in Ryan and McConnell, that weren't all on board with what he was up to.
Yeah, I think
that may have mattered, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And obviously, his primary early domestic priority didn't pass. I mean, there were enough Republicans in the Senate, John McCain, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski, so that his number one priority, getting rid of Obamacare, didn't pass. So in that sense, yes, there was some evidence that Republicans were more willing to stand up to him in the first Trump term. I think in the second term, it's just 100% clear that he owns that party, that there is zero room for dissent. If you want any sort of future political career, and by and large, because of that, Republicans have decided to fold in. Now, here's the other I think thing that's changed is that, over the last 8 years, there's sort of two ideas that have become mainstream inside the Republican Party. One is that democracy is really not worth it any longer, right? That it's outdated, that it's antiquated.
This version of it, right? They would argue this version of it.
This version of it, but I think the version that they want probably doesn't sort of actually look like a participatory democracy. It's a CEO form of government in which you hand one person lots of power. And then the other idea is that progressives are an existential threat to American identity, and that this is a white Christian country, and that any political party that supports, for instance, real multicultural diversity is a threat to the idea of America. I think those were slightly more fringe ideas inside the party 8 years ago. I think they are mainstream ideas today, which is why you are seeing Republicans, by and large, get on board with Trump's attempts, for instance, to use the DOJ to lock up and round up his enemies, because the middle of the Republican Party now believes that Democrats are a threat to the Republic.
So you know what they would argue? They would argue that the progressives were trying to otherize MAGA, and this feels like a revenge, and it's vice versa. I mean, this is what's so weirdly ugly about our time. Everything it seems to be a grievance, and particularly like the way he's gone about weaponizing government. It appears anybody that pushed back against him in the first term, even in his own party, even in his own staff, see John Bolton, and so the whole MAGA movement was considered out of the mainstream, out of otherized, out of the wrong culture. Do you think this is the motivation to sort of otherize progressives?
No, that sounds like a rationalization for what he's doing. And I don't think there's any rationalization for what he's doing, right? What he has done is to take a step that arguably no president has taken in modern times, which is to make the Department of Justice an arm of the White House and to use it as a means to try to compel loyalty to him. What he is doing on college campuses, to the legal profession, to his political opponents, is unprecedented. There's nothing that Joe Biden was doing, despite his antipathy for the MAGA movement, that parallels what Donald Trump is doing. And so I don't really think it makes sense to get involved in a conversation about sort of why he's doing it, because
it's a weird, I always say it's a weird form of projection, meaning they're doing what they told themselves the left was doing.
Yeah,
Is where, I'm not saying the left was doing this. They decided that's what the left did, so that's how they rationalize it for themselves.
yeah. I guess that's true, and I guess that's what happens when you exist in a super closed media ecosystem.
We have a broken information
in
ecosystem.
which you are only listening, as a Republican political leader to OAN and Newsmax and really radical right sources.
Well, I get at this because it's one of the more stunning facts to me is that Robert Kennedy Jr. is actually the most popular cabinet secretary. And he's doing amongst the most harmful, potentially harmful and things that we've seen anybody in charge of public health done. I think it's an example of our broken information ecosystem. What other explanation is there?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we also live in a world, especially on the right, in which theater is value, right? Celebrity is virtue. And so if you are combative and you are commanding headlines and you are owning your opponents, which RFK Jr. is pretty good at doing, then you have virtue. And so I think it's also a function of just the way in which we decide, who's worthy and who's unworthy, having been fundamentally changed.
So I asked you the difference between Senate Republicans and Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. Democratic response to Trump 1.0 versus the Democratic response to Trump 2.0. What are the differences?
Well, I mean, I do think this time around there's a growing understanding that, we might be near the end of the American Republic. The first time, it was all new, but there was, I think, not a fear that the democracy was near its end.
So there was a lot of rhetoric.
There's a lot of rhetoric
about
there.
it. And,
yeah.
I mean, it's funny you bring up the democracy message. I share the concern, but do voters?
Well, I mean, here's one of the key mistakes that the Harris campaign made, and I don't have a lot of quibbles with her campaign. I think she ran a really good race under difficult circumstances, but she ran on saving this version of democracy, and nobody in this country would show up at a rally for this version of democracy. This version of democracy is corrupt. It works only for elites mostly, and the Democratic Party, used to be the party that actively and aggressively campaigned to reform democracy. Like when I started out in politics, the Democratic Party talked about campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics as like a top 3 issue. It's now arguably not even a top 10 issue for the Democratic
That's another
Party.
case where voters don't share that concern for some reason.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
Or
I
is
think
it bad messaging?
I think voters do actually respond to parties that are prioritizing rhetoric about cleaning up Washington. I think that's in fact why Trump did so well in 2016, is that he was
The swamp message
was a good message. But I think today, voters look at the Republican corruption and they just think to themselves, well, I mean, Democrats aren't really any better. And I don't hear Democrats talking about.
Is that a fair criticism?
It's not a fair criticism. I don't think there is any parallel to what Donald Trump is doing right now to monetize the White House for his personal benefit. But it is a fair criticism that Democrats stop talking and prioritizing ways that we can clean up democracy. I think the Democratic Party should sort of have 2 tentpoles: unrigging the economy, populist economics, and unrigging the democracy. And then I think we should be willing to let a lot of people into that tent if you stand for those 2 things. And if we spend 80% of our time talking about economics and government reform, I think we'd have a shot to actually reach out and be attractive as a movement to some of Trump's voters.
You have been talking about broadening the tent.
Yeah.
Which also, in order to broaden the tent, you have to narrow your focus. And you just discussed the 2 pieces. What do you minimize?
Well, I mean, listen, it means you minimize everything. You don't minimize other things, but yes, it means you spend less time talking about virtually everything else. And I get it. That's really hard for the party because climate is an existential threat. I obviously have spent the last 10 years building up a movement around changing our gun laws because I can't stand the fact that our kids run for their lives in schools. There is a crisis going on with our LGBTQ community today because of how they are being targeted by the right wing. But
It also looks like a political tactic by the right to create a wedge in the Democratic Party.
but I would argue that if you look at the era in which the Democratic Party had big majorities, and we use those majorities to make progress on all issues, including social and cultural issues, that was a time when we did allow into the party people who didn't agree with us on gun.